I first met our next guest over 40 years ago when I was a humble concert agent and record producer, and he had just started an early instrument group called the Doofi Collective, a massively exciting band that went from strength to strength for 20 years. William Lyons is Professor of Medieval and Renaissance Studies at the Royal College and early music advisor to the Globe Theatre. And he's a composer, and he's arranged and advised on hundreds of scores for historic costume, drama, films, and plays. So we welcome him to the De Vere Society today to tell us about instruments and hierarchies in early modern theatre. Thank you, William Lyons.
This talk is about music and musicians in early modern theatre, particularly in London. And the music in early modern theatre is pretty well documented, but little is known of the actual musicians who would have played this music. In this paper, I'm going to survey the various paths that would lead a musician into the theatre. I'll also suggest that through analysis of the hierarchical and otherness of certain instruments can be revealed the status of musician who would have been employed in theatres at the time. Since the early medieval period, the distinction between loud and soft or quiet instruments had separated the loud wind and trumpets from those softer, plucked, bowed and blown instruments. The former were played by court and civic professional musicians, whilst the soft instruments were deemed suitable for non-professional as well as for professional players. There was a social acceptance that some instruments were more suitable for certain levels of society than others. As James Cleland stated in the Institution of a Young Nobleman in 1607, delight not to be in your own person a player upon instruments, especially upon such as commonly men get their living with. So the learning of playing of shawm, cornet and trombone was very much the province of the professional trade musician during the 16th and for most of the 17th centuries. In London, as was the case in most emergent powerful cities at this time, a civic band of professional drawn from musicians trained through the traditional livery company system of master and apprentice. At the royal court too, this categorisation was similarly maintained until well into the 17th century. Other routes to the musical profession came from non-livery-based training. Choristers were routinely taught to play instruments from an early age. Again, viols, lutes, keyboards, and of course singing predominated. In the university plays at Cambridge, the students played viols and the regals, a reed organ, in performance and sung, whilst the Cambridge waits were hired to provide extra music, most likely on the louder wind instruments not played by the students. In a society structured almost exclusively on hierarchy, it makes sense that there were certain musical instruments that remained in the ambit of a trade, whilst others had a more elevated status and were learnt and played for private entertainment by members of the upper echelons of society. The historian Christopher Marsh perhaps uses the clearest distinction for this. He says occupational musician for those who made their music their livelihood, and recreational musician for all others. The London waits were highly regarded and much in demand. They were also hired for their versatility and were tested for this in the appointment process, which would often pit two likely contenders for a post against each other to assess their skills on several instruments. Throughout the 16th century, a greater range of instruments was added to the Waits collection. As you can see, they brought several instruments. Sackbuts, which is the English name for the trombone, were very expensive instruments and bought by the city for the use of the Waits. A set of viols, cornets, recorders, and a kirtle, which is an early bassoon. And into the 17th century, the violin starts to appear in the payment records, as well as lutanists and singers, so the Waits expanding out. Thus, by the late 16th century, the Waits had amassed all the instruments needed for both soft and loud music and set about cementing their grip on musical activities in the City of London. With the rise of the theatre in London, an opportunity presented itself for further employment. the provision of music for plays by Waits certainly had precedence, as there is evidence of touring theatre troupes, those officially associated with noble patronage, hiring the local Waits band when visiting a town on tour. Also, as well as the aforementioned student plays in Cambridge, the Inns of Court in London employed the city music, the Waits, for their plays. As theatres began to proliferate and music become more established at indoor playhouses, and in particular the Blackfriars Playhouse, then the employment of a theatre band in addition to the acting musicians in the company became more frequent. The role of acting musician would still have been the norm in theatre companies, as hiring in a separate band of professional musicians would be costly and logistically problematic. The choristers and grammar schoolboys of St Paul's would have routinely learnt musical instruments alongside their vocal training, and these would have been utilised surely on the stage during their heyday in the 1570s and later at the beginning of the next century in the form of the boys' companies. At the Blackfriars Playhouse, as an essential element, music was woven in and around performances, and it may have had greater prominences and resources than at other contemporary spaces. The popularity of the children of the chapel that performed there from 1600 until 1608 was in part due to royal patronage, which led to a vogue for child plays. Music as an integral and ancillary part of the entertainment was certainly impressed, being remarked upon in the well-known observation by a German visitor, Friedrich Geschow, to the Blackfriars in 1602. Now he goes to the play, he sees that on the stage, before the play starts, there is a performance, and he mentions the instruments that the boys have. They have an exquisite concert of organs, lutes, bandoras, mandoras, bowed strings, woodwinds, such as this time, when a boy sang so beautifully in a warbling voice to a bass viol that unless the nuns in Milan may have outdone him, we didn't hear the like on our travels. So obviously very impressed. The instruments described here form the constituents of what was referred to as the consort in early modern England, and nowadays commonly known as the broken consort, broken meaning whole, not whole, a mixed consort of different instruments. This specifically defined group of lute, treble viol, later violin, bass viol, citon, bandora, and flute or recorder was apparently popular at the English court and is to be found used in plays from as early as 1566. Intriguingly, in 1599, Thomas Morley, composer, singer, theorist and publisher, published his first book of consort lessons for this very ensemble and dedicated it to the careful handling of the Waits of the City of London. He called them the excellent and expert musicians. Whilst there's no evidence of a direct link between this publication and the music played in the Blackfriars Playhouse, the fact that a consort is playing there in 1602, and there is a link to the consort and theatre stretching back several decades, it's tempting to suggest and suppose that Morley's motivation in dedicating the consort lessons to the Waits is because they had already established themselves as the players of this repertoire. Gershow's account implies that it was the boys who provided this concert before the play, but it's not explicit, and the possibility is there that the Waits, or at least some of their number, were playing on stage as well that day. In addition to the Morley publication, at least one other source of consort music survives in printed form from the early 17th century that may well have direct connection with theatre performance. Philip Rossiter was a court lutenist and is significant in that of those who produced the surviving broken consort books, he has the clearest line of contact with the theatrical world of the time. In 1609, the same year that he published his own lessons for consort, Rossiter, along with a goldsmith, Robert Keesar, became associated with the management of a company of boys actors, the Children of Whitefriars, later renamed the Children of the Queens, based at Whitefriars Theatre. Rossiter's publication of his lessons for consort in the same year that he took over management of a boys' company, if not designed, certainly seems fortuitously coincidental. The instruments of the consort all fall within the soft instrument category, therefore acceptable for those to play for whom music is not their occupation. There are frequent references to a consort playing in Elizabethan and Jacobean plays, so this, coupled with the concrete evidence that 2 apprentice actors were left a bass viol, a citon, bandora, and lute in the will of the actor Augustin Phillips in 1605, could well suggest that the consort was an ensemble suited to both professional and the actor-musicians alike. So, from within the plays themselves is to be found more evidence that the consort was well established as a theatre band by the 1580s, associated at first with royal entertainment, as were the boys' companies, noble households, and then in the private and public playhouses. In Thomas Decker's Old Fortunatus of 1599, performed by the Admiral's men at the Rose Theatre, Shadow enters. So you can see here the delicate warble, delicious strings, and heavenly wire drawers must surely be the broken consort again, flute, viols, and lute, and the metal-strung citon and bandora. Again, in Anthony Munday's translation of an Italian play, The Two Italian Gentlemen of 1586, we find the consort sounding a pleasant galliard, sounding again. They play a solemn dump, and then the consort soundeth a pleasant allemande at the end of each of the acts. Things become a little less clear when the other instruments called for in playtexts are taken into consideration. In the surviving prints that contain more than basic instructions for the music required in the performances, there are often examples of the use of several different kinds of instruments. One significant fact that has not been considered until now is that the instruments called for are often those as commonly men get their living with, as Cleland put it, the instruments of the occupational, professional musician. These include hautboys, which are shawms, a reed instrument, cornet, sackbut, trumpets, fife, and drums. The Waits in London had successfully petitioned to effectively control the employment of musicians in the city and its environs in the late 1500s. This certainly included theatre work when offered, which it certainly was, as we know, not from a play text actually, but in the form of an official complaint in 1613, which states that the Waits failed to turn up for the wedding of a magistrate's daughter because they had instead taken on perhaps more lucrative employment in a public theatre. In 1634, preparations for a masque and its preceding procession made note of the band of the Blackfriars Playhouse, who the organiser, Bulstrode Whitlock, hoped to employ. They were John Adson, Ambrose Bieland, Henry Field, Thomas Hutton, Francis Parker, and Ralph Strachey. All these musicians were established and experienced multi-instrumentalists, playing on an impressive variety of wind and strings, and quite possibly more than those recorded here. They would have been the ideal musicians to embrace the provision of music to accompany different scenes, moods, and dramatic events in a play. Thus, a broad palette of instrumental colours was available from the 6 players, such as at the Blackfriars. In the tragedy of Tancred and Gismond in 1591, a play presented by the Gentlemen of the Inns of Court, there's a description of the music heard between the acts. So before the second act there was heard a sweet noise of still pipes. Before the Act 3, the hautboys sounded a lofty allemande. Before Act 4 there was heard a consort of sweet music, and before Act 5 was a dead march played. Recorders, shawms, probably sackbut, and a mixed consort, all used with a variety of different styles and textures. Of particular interest is the number and variety of instruments that could be cued, sometimes occurring within a matter of a few lines. For example, in Rowley's When You See Me, You Know Me in 1605, we have character Tai says, give breath to your loud, tuned instruments, and loud music is cued. And then there's some discourse upon the actual nature of music. And then we have soft music called for. And finally, at the end, a song is asked for. First, loud music is called for, presumably cornets and hautboys and sackbuts perhaps. 6 lines later, soft music on recorders or consort, followed by a song, with or without instrumental accompaniment. In order for this to be executed smoothly, either different ensembles of instrumentalists were required, or a band who were able to double on loud and soft wind as well as bowed and plucked strings. The actors themselves may well have provided some of the soft music and singing, but the loud music would have been played by the waits. And if they fulfilled that role, then it would be logical to then exploit the full range of their versatility. Other evidence exists within playtext to support the likely employment of the waits. For example, in the book of Sir Thomas More, 1595, the waits play Enter Lord Mayor. And in Lord Mayor, and in Thomas Heywood's If You Know Not Me Part 2, there's a cue that says Enter the waits in sergeants' gowns. And in Robert Armin's The History of the Two Maids of Morclack in 1609, we have What are the waits of London come? Yes, sir. Play in their highest key then, hautboys play, sound hautboys. Bit of a misalignment of the cue there, but we can see what's intended. Violins were very much in vogue by the early 17th century. Yet again were instruments played by the occupational professional and not the recreational amateur musician. Progressing further into the century, references to fiddlers become more frequent in the text and rubric of dramas, both in those performed at indoor playhouses, but also in the open space of the Globe Theatre, belying the oft-stated assertion that strings and open-air theatres didn't mix. So, by identifying the instrumental cues and noting their proximity to each other in the play, and then matching this information with the conventional hierarchy of instrumental practice, I suggest that it is possible to identify, with greater clarity perhaps, particular types and status of musicians playing in the principal theatres in early modern London, and the various paths that led them to be part of this thriving culture. Thank you.
That was really fascinating, and I can tell by the way you gave that short lecture that you had millions of things you could probably have told us beyond that, and I hope our paths will cross again, and we're absolutely delighted that you could bring your high-flown expertise to the De Vere Society. Very honoured by it too. Thank you very much.